The night my husband stood up at our anniversary dinner and introduced the woman beside him as his business partner and closest confidant. Every person in that room went quiet. 63 guests, family, friends, people who had known us for decades, turned to look at me. He expected me to smile politely and sit back down. What he didn't expect was for me to reach into my handbag, pull out a sealed envelope, and set it gently on the table in front of him. His face changed the second he recognized what it was, and that was only the beginning of what I had planned. My name is Paulette Marsh, and for most of my adult life, I thought I understood what a good marriage looked like. I thought I had one. Looking back now, I realize how quietly dangerous that kind of certainty can be. When you've spent 38 years beside the same person, you stop examining things too closely. You stop questioning the small shifts. You trust what you've built together, and you assume that trust is mutual. That assumption nearly cost me everything. I met my husband, Gerald Holloway, in the autumn of 1985. I was 24 years old and working as a junior bookkeeper for a small accounting firm in Winnipeg. Gerald was 27. A structural engineer, with a laugh that filled whatever room he was in, and a habit of making everyone feel like the most interesting person he'd ever met. I fell in love with that version of him completely. We married in June of 1987 in a small church outside the city. My dress was cream-colored and borrowed from my cousin. The reception was held in my parents' backyard. We could barely afford the caterer. Gerald's grandmother made the cake herself. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours, and I was happy in a way I had never been before, and I think, never quite expected to be again. The early years were hard in the way that early years often are. Money was tight. Gerald worked long hours, and I worked alongside him. Not at the same firm, but in every way that mattered. When he decided to leave his position and start his own engineering consultancy, Holloway Structural, I was the one who handled the books. I set up the accounting systems from scratch. I tracked every invoice, every expense, every tax filing. When the banks hesitated to extend credit to a firm with no track record, I negotiated personally. I used a small inheritance from my grandmother as collateral for the initial operating loan. That terrified me. If the business failed, we could lose nearly everything we had. Gerald knew that. He looked me in the eye the night before we signed the documents and said, "I'll spend the rest of my life making sure this was worth it." I believed him. I believed him for a very long time. The business grew slowly at first, then steadily, then quickly. By the mid-90s, Holloway Structural had contracts across Manitoba and Saskatchewan. By the early 2000s, we had offices in Calgary as well. Gerald became something of a name in Western Canadian engineering circles. He was invited to sit on industry boards, to speak at conferences, to advise on infrastructure projects. Through all of it, I was beside him. Not always visibly. I stepped back from the day-to-day operations once we could afford to hire proper staff, but always present. I organized the professional dinners. I managed relationships with long-term clients. I remembered birthdays and anniversaries and the names of people's children. I was, in many ways, the quiet infrastructure of everything Gerald built. Our son, Owen Holloway, was born in 1990. Our daughter, Cecily, 3 years later. They grew up watching their parents build something together, and I was proud of that. Whatever else happened, I wanted them to grow up, understanding that a marriage was a partnership. I don't know exactly when things began to change. That's the honest answer. There's no single moment I can point to and say, that's when I should have known. It happened the way erosion happens. Gradually, imperceptibly, until one day, you look at the shoreline and realize the shape is completely different from what it used to be. Gerald started spending more evenings at the Calgary office. At first that made sense. The Alberta market was expanding and there were new contracts to pursue. Then the evenings became weekends. The weekends became weeks at a time. He called less. When he did call, the conversations were shorter, more distracted. He'd developed the habit of checking his phone mid-sentence, which he'd never done before. I made excuses for him. I'm ashamed of how many excuses I made. Then came the smaller things. A new watch he mentioned offhandedly, more expensive than anything he'd worn in 30 years of marriage. A haircut that was sharper than usual. A new cologne I didn't recognize. None of these things meant anything on their own. Together, they formed a picture I didn't want to look at directly. The morning I noticed he'd removed his wedding band before a video call. He said it was uncomfortable, that he'd gained weight in his fingers. I finally let myself sit with the thought I'd been pushing away for months. Something is wrong. I didn't confront him. Not yet. I've thought about that choice often since, and I still believe I made the right one. At 61 years old, after 38 years of marriage, I understood one thing clearly. I needed facts before I needed a conversation. Emotion without evidence gives the other person the advantage. I wasn't going to give Gerald that advantage. I started paying attention in a way I hadn't in years. Gerald had always shared his calendar with me, a habit from the early days of the business, when I needed to coordinate client meetings. He'd never bothered to revoke my access, and I'd never thought to look at it closely. I looked now. In January of that year, Gerald had listed a week-long trip to Calgary for a project assessment. I remembered that week. He'd called me twice. Once from was his hotel room, once from a client dinner. The calendar noted the hotel as the Fairmont downtown. A week later, I found a credit card statement that had arrived in paper form. Gerald had switched most of our accounts to paperless years ago, but this one older card still came by mail. The Fairmont charge was there. 2 guests. 4 nights. The checkout date was 2 days later than Gerald had come home. I sat with that statement for a long time. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I think I had already known, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, for quite some time. I didn't say a word. I made a photocopy of the statement, put it in a folder, and placed that folder in the back of my filing cabinet, behind 30 years of tax records that I suspected Gerald had never once opened. Over the following weeks, I found more. Nothing dramatic. No love letters, no photographs, just the quiet accumulation of inconsistency. Charges in cities he'd claimed to be elsewhere. Gaps in a calendar that should have been full. A name that appeared in his business act as under the description BD Consulting. Renata Voss. I hadn't heard that name before. I looked her up. She had a LinkedIn profile and a professional website. She described herself as a business development strategist. Her client list was vague. Her firm had been incorporated 18 months earlier, roughly the same time Gerald's behavior had begun to shift. I am a woman who spent 40 years working with numbers. Numbers tell stories that people can't edit in real time. I kept looking. It was my daughter, Cecily, who first said what neither of us wanted to say out loud. She'd driven up from Regina to visit in March, and we were sitting at my kitchen table with tea going cold between us. She'd noticed the same things I had, the distance, the distraction, the changes in her father, and she'd carried it alone for months, trying to protect me. "Mum," she said finally, staring at her cup, "I think something's really wrong." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "I know." She looked up at me, startled. "How long have you known?" "Long enough," I said. "I'm handling it," she cried then. Not loudly. Cecily has always been quiet in her grief, like water finding a level rather than making a wave. I held her and told her that whatever happened, she was not responsible for any of it. She hadn't caused it. She couldn't fix it. That was my job. Owen's reaction when I eventually told him in April was different. My son is his father's son in many ways. Practical, task-focused, quick to problem solve. He listened carefully, asked careful questions, and then said something that sat badly with me for a long time. "Mum, before you do anything, have you thought about what this would do to the business?" Dad's at a really critical point with the Calgary's expansion. I looked at him for a moment. "I've thought about quite a few things, Owen." "I know. I just mean, maybe there's another explanation. Maybe Renata Voss is genuinely a business contact. Maybe," I said. I didn't tell him about the hotel receipts. Not yet. Owen would come to the truth in his own time. I wasn't interested in persuading him. I was interested in being prepared. A friend of mine, a woman I'd known since our children were in primary school together, recommended a lawyer named Frances Whitmore. Frances had a reputation for handling complex asset disputes with discretion and thoroughness. I called her office on a Tuesday morning and made an appointment for that Friday. Frances Whitmore was in her early 60s, sharp-eyed and precise, the kind of woman who had heard every version of every story and still managed to listen to yours as though it were new. She spent 2 hours going through what I'd gathered. When I described my role in the early years of the business, The bookkeeping, the loan guarantees, the collateral. She leaned forward slightly. Do you still have documentation from that period? I kept everything, I said. She looked at me steadily. Good. Find all of it. That evening I spent 4 hours in my basement storage room going through bankers' boxes I hadn't opened in over a decade. Old ledgers, loan agreements, partnership documents from the early incorporation, tax filings from 1989 through 2003, the years when I had done them myself, property documents tied to assets used as collateral in the business's early expansion. As I worked through box after box, memories came back in pieces. The sleepless nights, the months when I skipped buying new clothes so there would be enough in the operating account to make payroll. The client dinners I attended and smiled through when I was exhausted and stressed and hadn't slept properly in days. Gerald had been the face of the firm. I had been much of its foundation. The paperwork confirmed what I'd known emotionally for years but never thought to quantify. My name appeared on more documents than I'd remembered. My guarantees had been essential to the company's early survival. An independent financial advisor Francis brought in. A careful, methodical man named Douglas Parrish. Spent 3 weeks reviewing the records. His conclusion was careful but clear. My contribution to the company's early financial stability had been significant and was well documented. Around the same time, Gerald announced something that immediately struck me as wrong. We were eating dinner on a Thursday evening in May. He set down his fork, looked across the table, and said, I've been thinking we should have a proper anniversary dinner this year. 40 years is worth celebrating. I looked at him. We're 38 years married. He waved that off. Rounding up, you only get 1/40th. I've been talking to the Kensington about hosting it. The Kensington was the most prestigious private dining room in the city. Business leaders held their galas there. Politicians held their fundraisers there. It was not where a man took his wife for a quiet anniversary celebration. Who would we invite? I asked carefully. Friends, family, colleagues, maybe 60 or 70 people. He picked up his fork again. Clients, too. It's a good opportunity. A good opportunity. There it was. Gerald had never once suggested hosting a large event in 38 years of marriage. He had forgotten our actual anniversary twice in the past decade. Now he wanted to rent the Kensington and invite clients. I smiled and said it sounded lovely. Then I excused myself to call Francis Whitmore. A week before the dinner, an old colleague of Gerald's named Howard Sinclair called me directly. Howard had been involved with Holloway Structural since almost the beginning. Not as a partner, but as an early client who'd become a genuine friend. He'd known both of us for 30 years. Paulette, he said. He paused. I want to ask you something, and I hope you'll understand why I'm asking. Go ahead. Have you heard Gerald mention bringing anyone new into the business? A partner of some kind? My pulse moved. Why? Another pause. There's been some talk, at the board level. I don't want to repeat things I'm not certain of, but I thought you should know there's talk. I asked what kind of talk. Howard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, about restructuring, and about a woman named Renata Voss having more involvement than anyone quite understands. I thanked him. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time. I wasn't surprised, exactly. But hearing it from Howard made it concrete in a way my own suspicions hadn't. The pieces were arranging themselves into a shape I recognized now. This dinner wasn't a celebration. It was a stage. Gerald was planning to use it for an announcement, and whatever that announcement was, he wanted an audience of clients and colleagues present when he made it. I called Frances that same afternoon. I told her I thought we needed to accelerate the timeline. How soon? She asked. Before the dinner, I said. She was quiet for a moment. I can have the papers ready. I picked them up 2 days before the event. The envelope sat in my handbag for 48 hours. I didn't take it out again until the night of the dinner. I spent a long time getting ready that evening. I chose a dark green dress I'd bought 2 years earlier and never found an occasion for. I did my hair carefully. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a moment before going downstairs, and I thought, whatever happens tonight, I am ready for it. The Kensington dining room was beautiful. Long tables set with white linen and low candlelight. Arrangements of white and ivory flowers at every setting. Soft music from a quartet in the corner. Gerald had spent a great deal of money creating exactly the right atmosphere, and he had succeeded. The room looked like something from a magazine. 63 guests arrived over the course of an hour. Family, friends, business associates, long-term clients. People I had known for decades. I greeted them all. I accepted embraces and congratulations, and questions about how it felt to be celebrating so many years together. I answered warmly and kept the envelope exactly where it was. Cecily was there, seated near the middle of the room. The moment our eyes met, she crossed the space between us immediately, took both my hands, and held them. She didn't ask questions. She simply stayed close, and I was grateful for that. Owen arrived later, looking slightly uneasy. He hugged me and held on a beat longer than usual. "You okay, Mum?" I told him I was fine. He studied my face, then nodded and went to find his seat. By the time dinner was served, the room had settled into the easy rhythm of a successful event. Conversations flowed. Glasses were refilled. Gerald moved between tables, charming and attentive, the version of himself he showed the world. I watched him from my seat and thought about how well I had once known the man behind that performance. Then Renata Voss arrived. She came in during the salad course, unhurried, as though being 40 minutes late to a dinner you hadn't been publicly invited to was a perfectly natural thing. She was perhaps 45, well-dressed in a way that announced itself. Self-possessed in the manner of someone accustomed to entering rooms and being noticed. Several heads turned. I noticed the people who recognized her exchange glances. She was seated at Gerald's end of the table, not beside me. I watched Gerald notice her arrival. The shift in him was small. A slight lift, a change in posture, a smile that was different from the smiles he'd been offering all evening. The kind of smile you can't manufacture. The kind that appears without permission. Howard Sinclair was seated 2 chairs to my left. He leaned slightly toward me without turning his head. "You see her," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "I see her," I said. By the time dessert was cleared, I could feel the energy in the room shift. Certain people, the business contacts, the board-adjacent figures, seemed to be waiting for something, the kind of focused anticipatory attention that doesn't belong at an anniversary dinner. Gerald stood. A staff member appeared at his elbow with a wireless microphone. Gerald smiled and accepted it with the ease of a man who had done this many times. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began. "Paulette and I have been grateful for every one of you through the years. The people in this room represent the best of what we've built." He looked toward me and raised his glass. "To 38 years." The room raised their glasses. I raised mine. Then Gerald set his glass down and his voice shifted. Not dramatically. Most people probably didn't notice. But I noticed. "A company, like a marriage, goes through seasons," he said. "And the best companies, like the best people, know when it's time to grow into something new." A few quiet looks were exchanged around the room. Over the past year and a half, I've had the privilege of working with someone who has brought tremendous vision to Holloway Structural. Someone who has helped me see the next stage of what this firm can become. He paused. "I'd like to ask Renata Voss to stand." The silence that followed lasted only 2 or 3 seconds, but it was the kind of silence that changes the temperature of a room. Renata stood, composed, unsurprised, as though this moment had been rehearsed. Gerald looked at her with an expression I recognized and hadn't seen directed at me in years. The room seemed to hold its breath. "Renata will be joining Holloway Structural as a co-principal," Gerald said. "She represents the future of this firm, and I couldn't be more proud to, Gerald." My voice was calm. It carried. The room turned to me. Gerald turned to me. For just a moment, his expression showed something close to alarm. Not because I'd spoken, but because of how I'd spoken. Without trembling, without tears, without any of the emotions he had apparently expected. I stood. I did not rush. I picked up my glass, set it down again. I smoothed the front of my dress. Then I reached into my handbag and removed the envelope. Every eye in the room followed my hand. I walked the length of the table. Gerald tracked me the whole way, his expression shifting through confusion, and then something else. Recognition, perhaps. The beginning of understanding. I stopped in front of him. I looked at him for a moment. Then I held out the envelope. "Since we're making announcements," I said quietly, "I thought I'd make one of my own." He took the envelope because there was nothing else to do. His hands were not steady. He opened it and read the first page. The color left his face. I gently took the microphone from his hand. He didn't resist. I turned to face the room. Gerald has spent this evening celebrating what we built together, I said. I want to mark that too, because we did build something real. 38 years ago, I used my grandmother's inheritance as collateral so this company could survive its first year. I ran the books when we couldn't afford to hire anyone. I kept this firm alive through 3 recessions and a great deal of personal sacrifice. I was proud of that for a long time. The room was absolutely still. Those are divorce papers Gerald is holding, I said. And they're accompanied by documentation of my legal interest in the assets of Holloway Structural, which my attorney has already filed with the appropriate parties. A sound moved through the room. Not quite a gasp. Not quite a murmur. Something in between. Gerald looked up from the papers. Paulette. His voice was low, strained. This is not the place. You chose the place, I said simply. I held his gaze for a moment. Then I turned to Cecily, who was already standing, already moving toward me. We walked out together. I didn't look back. The days that followed were the kind I had braced for, and still wasn't fully prepared for. Calls from people I hadn't expected to hear from. Silence from others I had. A few who simply sent flowers without any message, which somehow said more than the people who wrote long letters. Owen came to see me 3 days after the dinner. He looked like he hadn't slept. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table and didn't speak for almost a full minute. Finally he said, I should have listened to you. Yes, I said. But you were afraid of what it meant. He nodded slowly. I kept thinking there had to be another explanation. That maybe I was reading it wrong. I know. I poured him tea. You wanted him to be the person you thought he was. That's not something to be ashamed of. It just means you loved him. He was quiet for a while. Then he looked up. What happens now? The lawyers sort through it, I said. That takes time. But I'm going to be all right. He looked at me, the way children sometimes look at their parents when they finally see them as a complete person rather than a function. I know you will, he said. And then quietly, I'm sorry I wasn't more useful earlier. I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. You're here now. Cecily and I spoke almost every day during that period. She had been carrying the weight of what she knew for the months, and she needed to put it down. We talked, really talked, in a way we hadn't since she was a teenager. About her father, about fear, about the particular loneliness of being the person who sees something everyone else is pretending not to see. You weren't weak, I told her one evening. You were caught between people you loved. That's one of the hardest places to stand. She cried then. We both did, a little. The investigation Douglas Parish had begun continued through the summer. What emerged over the following months was complicated, and I will say only this. Renata Voss had gained access to a great deal of sensitive information about Holloway Structural's ongoing projects and client relationships. Whether that access had been leveraged in ways that constituted a legal problem was a question for other people to determine. What I knew was that Gerald had handed the keys of a company I had helped build to someone whose interests did not appear to align with its long-term health. Howard Sinclair called me in July. His voice was grave. Several board members had requested an independent review of certain contracts and decisions from the past 18 months. 2 significant clients had raised concerns about confidential project details appearing in a competitor's proposal. No one was accusing anyone of anything specifically, but questions were being asked and the answers were not satisfying. I felt no satisfaction in this. I want to be clear about that. There is a version of this story where I might have taken pleasure in watching Gerald's choices catch up with him. That version is not mine. What I felt was something closer to grief. For the man he had been 20 years earlier, for the marriage I'd believed in, for the time that had passed. Gerald called me in August. He asked if we could meet. We had coffee at a small place near the river. He looked like he had aged considerably since the dinner, though only a few months had passed. The confidence he had always worn so naturally was gone. He seemed reduced somehow, and I found that both sad and, if I'm honest, slightly clarifying. For a long time I had wondered if I'd misjudged the situation. Looking at him, I no longer wondered. I made serious mistakes, he said. Yes. I convinced myself I was entitled to something different, Something more. He shook his head. I don't even know what I was looking for. I think you were looking for someone to tell you that you were still extraordinary, I said. And Renata told you that. Whether she meant it or not is a separate question. He was quiet for a moment. She didn't, he said finally. Mean it. I nodded. I had suspected that. The evidence suggested someone whose interest in Gerald had been at least partly strategic, and a man who wanted to feel important was easy to influence if you knew how to make him feel seen. Do the kids hate me? He asked. Cecily is hurt, I said. Owen is working through it. Neither of them hates you. They're disappointed, which is harder. He absorbed that. Then he said, What about you? I thought about that for a while. I'm tired, I said finally. I'm tired of the version of us that existed for the last several years. I'm not tired of the years before that. I'm not going to pretend those didn't happen. He looked at the table. I keep thinking about the early days, when we were starting out. So do I. You kept everything, he said. All those records, I never thought about any of that. I know, I said. And I did know, because the Gerald who locked his phone and forgot our anniversary had stopped paying attention to anything that didn't directly serve what he wanted in the moment. The records survived because I was the one who had always understood that the past doesn't stop mattering just because the present has moved on. We finished our coffee. Outside on the sidewalk, we stood for a moment in the thin autumn light. I'm sorry, Paulette, he said. I looked at him, the man who had once squeezed my hand across a kitchen table and asked what would happen if he failed. I'll never forget that night. I'll never forget how much I meant it when I said we'd fail together. I know you are, I said. And then I turned and walked toward the water, where the light was good and the path ahead was open. The divorce was finalized the following spring. The settlement took longer than I'd hoped, and less out of me than I'd feared. Francis Whitmore was as thorough as advertised, and the documentation from those early years proved as significant as Douglas Parrish had predicted. I won't pretend the legal process was easy. It wasn't. But I had people beside me, and that made the difference. I moved into a smaller house in the Wolseley neighborhood of Winnipeg. A brick character home, with a front porch, and a garden that needed work and windows that let in more light than any room of my previous house. I bought it in March, and spent the first weeks simply sitting in different rooms at different times of day, learning the light. Cecily helped me paint the kitchen. Owen built me bookshelves for the front room. We ate pizza on the floor and argued about colors, and laughed more than I expected to. And somewhere in the middle of an ordinary Saturday afternoon, I realized that whatever I had lost, I had not lost this. I started a small practice that year. Nothing formal, just word-of-mouth work helping women in their 50s and 60s understand their financial situations during separation or divorce. Women who had done what I had done. Stepped back from careers, managed households, let their husbands handle the accounts, and who now found themselves bewildered and frightened by documents they'd never been invited to read. I sat with them at kitchen tables and went through paperwork and tried to give them the one thing I'd had that many of them didn't. The understanding that their contributions had a name and a value and a legal weight. It mattered. I could tell it mattered by the way people's shoulders changed when they understood they were not starting from nothing. One afternoon in the autumn of that year, I was walking home along the river path when I stopped and stood for a while watching the light change on the water. It was the kind of afternoon that doesn't announce itself, just a quiet hour between tasks. The city going about its business behind me, the river steady in front of me. I thought about the woman who had sat with a hotel receipt in her hands 14 months earlier, trying to find a reason it might mean something other than what it meant. I didn't recognize her anymore. Not because she was gone, but because she had become someone more complete. The grief was real, and I carry it honestly, the way you carry anything that cost you something. But grief and freedom are not opposites. Sometimes they arrive together. I walked the rest of the way home, through the last of the afternoon light, and when I turned my key in the door and the house received me, I felt something I had almost forgotten was possible. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be.